Okay, so apologies for the disruption in service there. My last video got totally corrupted right at the point that I left off there, so there's a bit of break here, but there you are, you got your break anyway. I hope you scratched your heads as I suggested. This postmodernism that I'm now talking about is as I said yesterday in the other video, quite separate from the postmodern design idea in the sense that they operate completely different. They're thinking about different things. I'm not saying one is better than the other, or anything like that. What I'm saying is that they're operating in different arena, and postmodern design is a branch of design. It fits into design history. What this postmodernism is a philosophical process. It's not a philosophical movement or part of philosophy necessarily. It's I mean, it is part of philosophy, but the postmodernists wouldn't really want to think of it in those terms. It's a process. Let's think of philosophical postmodernism as a process. And that's what makes it so interesting and so powerful, and why it's had such an impact on our society, both politically and sort of socially. So much, as I was beginning to say yesterday, so much of our environment, political, social, is a result of postmodernism because of a process of deconstruction that our society has undergone since the 1960s, when these ideas began to emerge. But it's happened kind of slowly, and it feels like it's happened very organically, and it feels like it's happened quite naturally. And the resistance to that process of kind of postmodern opening up of possibilities has been just as important. And although it is a direct resistance in many ways, it's some quite times quite a virulent, kind of violent, maybe not violent necessarily in a physical sense, but an emotionally violent response to postmodernism. Altogether, it is packaged as postmodernism, and in fact, postmodernists would suggest that critiques of postmodernism are themselves postmodern. Anyway, let's not get totally confused right at the beginning. Let me try and explain what postmodernism is a little bit, and then we'll maybe try to come back to what I'm trying to say there. What I need you to just understand as we're going in here is that this postmodernism has defined us, does define us. Without this kind of postmodernism, we wouldn't have Facebook, we wouldn't have Amazon, and the ways in which we use those. Now, I'm not talking about the technology necessarily, although that is part of it. We certainly wouldn't have the way we think about politics and some of the political movements we have these days. The opening up of individuality, the fact of the individual, the absolute primacy of the individual, is something that we can root in postmodernism. Anyway, let's actually try and see what we're talking about. So, postmodernist authors. There are basically five people I'm talking about, and whether I'm talking about them specifically or not, this is who we're talking about, and they're all French, and there's a reason for that. And I don't want to make this lecture too long, so let's just say they're all French, and there's the reason for that, and we'll explore that later. There are other postmodernists, and of course, people who follow in the tradition of these five, and there are many all over the world, are not all French. But it is a largely French movement that then has an impact around the world. Lyotard is the first, and we'll talk about him in a second. The other two names, maybe names of all of them, these may be the most famous, Foucault and Derrida. They're kind of oh no, my goodness, not the center. They're very important figures in the development of postmodernism. The next, again, a really crazy one, very hot right now, at least was in the last few years. Everybody in academia and academic circles was reading Deleuze and quoting Deleuze. Everyone loves Deleuze. I have a natural rejection of Deleuze because of that. However, I'm now beginning to learn a little bit about Deleuze. Deleuze is very complicated, difficult to read, and a real challenge. Talk to Gord. Gord knows far more about Deleuze and has a far better grasp of Deleuze than I do. If you want to sit down and have a really interesting conversation, talk to Gord about Deleuze. You'll have a lot of fun, and you'll come out with your brain kind of aching and spinning at the same time. The last one is Baudrillard. He's kind of the most pop famous one. He had a flash of kind of almost mainstream fame in the wake of the Matrix movies, where he kind of analyzed those, and everyone who liked the Matrix movies 20 years ago thought that it was really awesome. Anyway, he's the kind of final figure there, not quite as significant as Deleuze, Foucault, and Derrida. They really are the main spots to try to hit. Also mentioned Fredric Jameson, who is, as I kind of commented, he's a critic. He's not a postmodernist. He's critical of postmodernism, but because his criticism has been following postmodernism from its advent, from the origins of postmodernism, he's a necessary part of the postmodern story. There are definitely other writers who would also fit into that, and I think there are a lot of people who know more about philosophy who probably have a lot of problems with everything I've just said, but I'm not completely wrong, and Jameson fits into that story. The thing, before I kind of keep moving forward, to really emphasize here is postmodernism didn't exist for these guys as a sort of a group collective thing. Postmodernism was a name that Lyotard used and then kind of immediately abandoned. Foucault and Derrida never used the word once. I mean, not really. They would not identify themselves as postmodernists. They would not even really identify that postmodernism exists. Deleuze as well. The whole point of postmodernism, as we'll try to begin to talk about, is there is no such thing as a collective. You can't categorize in that way for them. So even the very act of trying to arrange them, categorize them as postmodernist is not postmodern. So it's already problematic. They did not think of themselves as postmodernists. For those of us outside of that in some way, and this is where it gets very tricky to trying to talk about it from the outside, they are the postmodernists. These are the postmodernists. Or at least they're the thinkers who define postmodernism. Baudrillard did use the word postmodern and actually kind of engaged with it pretty directly. For us in Craft and Design, of the 5 here or 6 here, he's perhaps the most relevant. He wrote a book called The System of Objects, which is very much about objects and how they're made and how they're presented, how they're designed and how we engage with them. Definitely worth a look. A challenging read, but of the 5, he's the most accessible, I would say here. Lyotard actually is relatively accessible. Foucault and Derrida can be very hard work, but it's worth it. Deleuze also hard work. I can't yet say that it's worth it, but I trust from other people that it is worth it when you get to it. These writers are very challenging, and I would encourage you to look at their texts. Sometimes they have essays, they have bits and pieces, and if you pick up one of their readings and you start reading it and say, what, this doesn't make any sense, then you're on the right track. I think if you start reading it and you think, oh yeah, no, this makes perfect sense, then you're not reading it correctly and you're getting it wrong. They're difficult, and sometimes they're meant to be difficult. There's sort of intentional difficulty in it, but ultimately, and I can't remember if I said this in the part of the video that survived yesterday, so if this is a repeat, I apologize. I think this may be the bit that got destroyed. They're ultimately, although they're incredibly complicated and they're quite different, none of them are saying the same things. That's why it's difficult to categorize them. They are quite different. Ultimately, all of them are quite simply just trying to look beyond. As I said at the beginning of yesterday's video, they're looking at the modern. They're looking at, and for them, the modern does begin back in the 18th century. For them, modern begins with Hegel, if not before. And they're trying to look beyond the modern and not just kind of look back to some ancient Greece or something, Plato or something. They're trying to look to something new, trying to actually create something new, whilst at the same time being fully aware that there is no such thing as new, that the context will always be with us one way or the other, and we mustn't deny context. The word postmodern originates in a book from 1979 by Lyotard, the first of the authors I mentioned there, called The Postmodern Condition. And this is kind of the first time that the word postmodern is used in philosophy in a sort of a formal sense. Although this was actually a report written for, sort of coincidentally, the Council of Quebec Universities. French writer, a French philosopher brought over to do a little bit of work write a report about education, technological education, basically. But at the same time, it's also the opening shot in the development, the story of postmodernism. Now, it's not the opening shot at all. Postmodernism, in terms of Foucault, Derrida, had been going on for a while. And we talk about postmodern design. Well, that was emerging from the 1960s, from the early 60s as well. So when I say the opening shot, all I mean is this is the first time that there's sort of an organization, a sense of organization to this thing that defies organization, specifically and sort of is against organization in that sense. I define postmodern as incredulity towards meta-narratives. This is a quote from the introduction to this book by Lyotard, and it is an excellent beginning for understanding what postmodernism is. Incredulity, look it up if you don't know what it means, sort of a distrust, a unwillingness to believe meta-narratives. Now, what meta-narratives are is a complicated question and concept, but it basically means stories that are bigger than us, stories that are bigger than the story you're reading. So Christianity, for example, is a meta-narrative. Love, as it is presented in texts from Shakespeare to The Great Gatsby, is something of a meta-narrative. And what postmodernism does is it distrusts that reliance on meta-narrative. It definitely, and I'll be repeating this, it definitely does not mean, postmodernism does not say those meta-narratives don't exist. It's crucial to emphasize that. Postmodernism does not say there's no such thing as Christianity, or Christianity is a hoax and everyone just needs to immediately stop believing anything that they thought they were believing before. What meta-narratives do is say we need to be thoroughly aware of the fact that these are stories, and they're stories that we created. I'm going to be unpacking that a little bit more. That love is a story we tell ourselves about ourselves. It doesn't deny the possibility and the existence of love. What it says is that if I say I love you, let's not have that mean something to do with Shakespeare and something to do with Romeo and Juliet and something to do with Mariah Carey song. Let's actually make it mean something about me and the person I'm speaking to, the I that is speaking and the person to whom that emotion is directed. Make it more direct. Kind of dissolve the reliance on the meta-narrative. Now, that doesn't mean we can't also listen to Mariah Carey songs or find Romeo and Juliet a romantic and touching and very well written story. What it means is that we understand that the use of the word love has this baggage, and we try to engage with that baggage and understand it and critique it and sort of get over it. We'll explain that a little bit more. Here's what meta-narratives look like. Here's our meta-narrative in the center. So this could be anything, and I'm specifically not writing anything down here because postmodernism, again, is very difficult to try to explain because it is meant to be difficult. Not because they don't want people to understand it, as is often sort of said casually by people who haven't made the effort to try and understand it, but because the very process of postmodernism is about difficultizing things, challenging anything, trying to pull it apart, and then perhaps put it back together again in a different way. So I'm not using words here because I don't want to. I'm not using text here because that would be specifically against the point. What I'm trying to illustrate here graphically is here are some texts, and by text I mean basically anything. So a text can be a text like a book, but a text can also be a painting. A text can also be a series of relationships between people or anything else. So when I use the word text, I'm using it in that very, very general sense. So here we have 5 texts, all of which have some kind of narrative within them, a self-contained narrative. It's the narrative of a story it's a make-believe story between a boy called Romeo and a girl called Juliet, and they fall in love. This one over here is a painting with a picture of a woman holding a baby, and it turns out that that's actually a baby whom she loves. I'm complicating things here. What they all have to do with, all of these things have to do with love, right? And that is the central feature, and they all connect and they all draw from this meta-narrative, right? Don't be confused in my example, they're almost verged into Christianity, which could be another meta-narrative. So in the example of Christianity, that picture of that is also about love between the mother and the child, turns out that's actually Mary and Jesus, and that connects to the meta-narrative of Christianity. Over here, within the a love story, the couple are not allowed to marry for religious reasons. I know that's not what happens in Romeo and Juliet, but let's just pretend for a second. For religious reasons, that's drawing on the meta-narrative of Christianity, because there are rules within Christianity that forbid them being married. Okay, that is a meta-narrative, and so the meta-narrative is this thing, this sort of central idea that that these texts rely on, draw their strength from, basically. Now, there's another way to think about the meta-narrative, and it's exactly the same thing, it's just a totally different way of thinking about it. Rather than the meta-narrative being a center that the other narratives kind of connect to, you can think of the meta-narrative as this huge thing that all of the stories fit within. So here in our, this is Christianity, all of the examples, all of the texts that draw from the meta-narrative or contain aspects or are conduits of the meta-narrative are within the meta-narrative. Both of these pictures represent exactly the same thing. They look totally different, but they are exactly the same thing. The meta-narrative is a force that exists separate from the text, but is somehow embodied in or travels through any given text within its orbit, basically, or that orbit it. And that's it. Here's within its orbit or orbit it. And the meta-narrative is this powerful thing that literature especially, but all kind of, not just cultural elements, but all of Western civilization has depended upon since the modern era, if not before. So this meta-narratives can also be the meta-narrative of a country. When you hear people talking about Canada, you could think of the concept of Canada as a meta-narrative, that it has something to do with battles fought in the First World War and Canada coming together as a country, or that it has something to do with hockey and Tim Hortons, and all of these aspects play into the idea of a country, and that could be considered a meta-narrative, that there's some singular defining feature that exists sort of separate from, but is a part of, or it has parts of it that can be looked at and identified. What the postmodernists are looking to do is challenge meta-narratives. Now, they are not trying to do this. They don't say that meta-narratives don't exist. They don't say that it's a free-for-all, that all the elements are unconnected, and no matter what you encounter, love or Christianity or Canada or anything else, none of it means anything. There's no such thing as Canada, anything, it's just this made-up thing, and anyone can just make up whatever they like about whatever. That is something that's an idea that is propagated by people who haven't spent time thinking about postmodernism. I should emphasize that I'm definitely not an expert. I'm only 15 years into my journey of understanding postmodernism, and there are people who are far more competent than me, so I would encourage you to carefully look at videos online about this, but be very careful. There's a lot of garbage out there, and if you hear someone saying that this is basically what postmodernism looks like, it's nothing means anything and it's all up for grabs, then you're watching a video by someone who doesn't know, who hasn't spent time really trying to understand postmodernism. What the postmodernists are doing is saying, understand what the meta-narratives are and understand that the meta-narratives exist, but try to see them, understand them for what they are. They're constructs. They exist. They're something we have constructed, that human beings have constructed, that we decide, we submit ourselves to, and maybe that's fine, and maybe that's good. Maybe it is good to hold a country together for technical, bureaucratic, and political reasons under these meta narratives. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. But maybe it is a good thing to allow for that to be challenged and allow for people to think kind of outside of that as well. One of the things that especially Foucault and Deleuze did, but all of them do in their own and kind of slightly different ways, is to challenge what it means to have what the relationship between meta-narrative and sort of its containers, or the things it contains. What all the postmodernists were, as I say, they were against modernism. They were against Hegel's idea of the dialectical method. Now, if you know anything about philosophy, you'll have encountered, or Marx especially, you'll have encountered dialectical method. But if, like me, you're kind of coming at it from a different angle, you may want to Google what dialectical method is. Basically, without reading all of Hegel instantly, it means that history is defined by contradictions, and that at any given time in history there's probably a contradiction going on. And what happens is this contradiction builds itself up to a point of needed change, and the change comes in the form of negation. Okay, so there I'm trying to sort of use Hegelian terms a little bit, although I'm far from a Hegel expert. What that means, let me give you an example. What that means is, the example would be capitalism. Capitalism is the system, so that is the system. It is defined by contradiction, and so in a Marxist sense, but this is also something Hegel might go along with. It's the contradiction between the people who own the industries and the people who work in the industries. That's how Marx would put it, perhaps. So I'm maybe not being too loyal to Hegel, but I am presenting the situation that the postmodernists are against. So the dialectical method says this contradiction between the owners of the means of production and the workers is going to keep getting worse and worse until there comes a point of revolution, we would say in this example, when a change needs to happen, and that change comes in the form of negation. Negation meaning that the needs of the workers negate the power of the owners of the means of production. So in that case, the revolution happens, the workers triumph, they take control of the means of production, and so that contradiction that existed before no longer exists because of the negation of the power of the owners, right? Now the postmodernists, especially again Foucault and Deleuze, don't see it that way. They see that history doesn't work like that, even though that is a tricky thing to say. But they see that this idea of negation isn't great. What they're looking for is affirmation, not negation, and they see affirmation as the agent of change. So what happens is the difference is recognized. The differences between this, in that example, the workers and the owners, have to be properly understood. And what happens when you begin to do the analysis is you see that actually there is no such thing as just owner of means of production and worker. You would begin to see perhaps that the owner of the means of production is in their own way a worker. Either they're working for themselves, or they're working for shareholders, or they're working for someone higher up, or someone who owns their company or whatever. The example is getting too specific, and I really want to get it back into the abstract where it really should be. So where there's change, it's not through negation, but it's through this affirmation. It's through recognition of these differences and basically dissolving those differences. Let me try to give you a more specific example. So that was kind of what I was just saying. Here's an example, and again, I'm not putting text on intentionally because I want to keep it slightly vague, even though I am giving a specific example. Here's 1970s England. Actually, 1970s Toronto would work just as well, so we'll do that. Heteronormativity, meaning the norm in mainstream society is that love exists, especially marriage, romantic love, permanent long-term romantic love exists between a man and a woman, and they get married, and that's it. right? This is the meta narrative of heteronormativity exists, and the man and the woman are it, and anyone who is outside it is outside it. So, in the dialectical method, what happens is that that situation is challenged, say by homosexual males, and they challenge the system and they push against it, and through a variety of changes they overcome. There's this dialect, there's this contradiction of heterosexuals against homosexuals, homosexual men. Let's be specific here, and so there's this contradiction, and it builds and it builds and it builds, and suddenly the negation is well actually it's going to be okay. So there's a negation of those feelings of whatever, and now the narrative expands to accept these, to allow homosexual men into this concept of love and in society and kind of permanent stability, and there's sort of this acceptance. However, that's the dialectical method understanding of what happens when homosexuality is sort of accepted by mainstream heteronormative society. Again, the example I'm trying to set it slightly historically in the 1970s. The postmodernists don't like that, again, especially Foucault and Deleuze, because what has happened here is that a new norm has been created, and that's exactly what Deleuze and Foucault don't like. They don't like the fact that in the dialectical system, what it does is it normalizes. It said, it's okay, now you can be like us. It normalizes, it takes the meta-narrative and expands it such that it sort of engulfs what previously had been rejected, and now it normalizes it. Now that act of normalization seems positive. Now it says, yay, it's cool. We're all in the same, kind of same happy boat. But as I hope you see from my diagram, and as I hope you can sort of know about our society, is that actually isn't a very positive way to go about things. Just sort of saying, okay, now it's officially cool. It works. It has its benefits. But what has happened there is there hasn't really been a fundamental change in the structure. There hasn't been a fundamental change in the way that the people who were previously in the group now think about their group. More importantly, far more importantly, especially far more importantly for Deleuze and Foucault, is the other groups who are still excluded are still excluded. There was no fundamental structural change in the system, and that's a problem because the system is still exactly as it was. It just shifted slightly. It normalized something that previously it had decided was not normal or didn't accept as normal, and so it has left out all sorts of groups, and you can imagine all the sorts of groups who are excluded from this. And of course there's a whole lot of history about this, and queer and trans histories. I'm definitely not qualified to start talking about that, but by looking at those histories even very superficially, you can see how some of the movements in the 1970s, which seem so positive, and quote unquote mainstream society pats itself on the back for being so open-minded and progressive, actually left behind a lot of people who continued to be and continue to be excluded. So what the postmodernists say is this is not the way to go about things. Really, the way to go about things is just to kind of get rid of these meta-narratives, to dissolve them where necessary. Now, again, that doesn't mean that they don't exist, and again, it doesn't necessarily mean a free-for-all. What it means is to recognize, to affirm difference in the first place, and that's a whole complicated story behind the use of those words there. But to see it more like this, to erode the system by recognizing that the system is in place, and these are not natural sort of just things that that it just exists. The rules that defined heteronormativity, that of man and male and female, and that's it. That's made up in a sense. Now the making up is important, and the fabrication is important. The very history of it, the fact that it had been around for so long is important. Even, and I really don't want to get into this, but the connections between biology is not to be denied. Postmodernism does not deny that. In this example, for instance. But what it does say is the way we use that information and the way we apply it in our social setting. It's up to us to decide how we apply that. And just grafting biology, especially biology that is interpreted through people. Herbert Spencer's sense of the survival of the fittest is a completely specific 19th century way of reading evolution, and it is the model that is relied upon when certain people go around saying things like, well, men have to be men and women have to be women, and that involves something like being tough and something like wearing high heels. It's definitely that's a very specific way of reading biology, and it's not accurate to just bring it into human social settings, unmoderated and unmodified. Again, it doesn't mean that the biological sexes don't exist. What it means is the way that they exist in society and the way they are applied in society is not the same as the way they just sort of exist in a test tube. Anyway, now I'm way off course and I'm talking way too much. Everything I've said is not entirely inaccurate, so you can rely on it. But as the postmodernists themselves would say, and as I definitely reinforce myself, everything I'm saying can be challenged and should rightfully be so, rightfully done. Before I wrap up, and I am going to wrap up, I'm going on longer than I expected, but it's good. It's good. You should take this in. This is big stuff. This is really, really, really big stuff and really important. But I hope you also see that I'm very suspicious of it, and ultimately I lie outside this. I'm too much of a universalist. I do believe in certain meta-narratives. Maybe I should have said this at the beginning. I do believe in certain meta-narratives, and at least believe in their importance in a way that the postmodernists don't accept. But let's set that aside. Let's talk about this dude really quickly, Derrida. He's very famous for a process called deconstruction. Again, it's not a philosophy, it's a process. And it's complicated and it's a lot of fun. It definitely denies meta-narratives and it denies the stability of structures. As Derrida himself says, we mustn't naturalize what isn't natural. That's pretty much a direct quote. But it's still not a free-for-all. And what he wants to do is really emphasize that the structures that are around us, both in texts where he began writing, but in our very being and our essence, they're not set in stone. So here's an example. You read the word tree. Anywhere, whatever, doesn't matter, in a book. You're reading a story and you read the word tree. And into your mind pops a picture of a tree. You're reading a story about an adventure, and into your mind pops this word tree, or you read a sentence, or you just read the word on the side, written on the sidewalk, and you read the word tree, and this pops into your mind. When the person who wrote that word, this was the tree they pictured. And so what Derrida says is there's a failing there. Let's take it out of the context of a book. Let's say you just read the word written on the sidewalk and you see the word tree. You picture the tree on the left, but the person who wrote the word actually was picturing the tree on the right. And what Derrida says is there's a failure in language there. Language has failed to communicate the idea that was in the writer's head into the head of the reader's head. So what he's saying is that exists, that can be writ large. The failure to communicate accurately. Aristotle said humans are political because we communicate and we're able to communicate. Derrida is not denying that. What he's saying is that we have a failure to communicate accurately. And that's where so many of our issues come from, and both as a society and very much internally because of this failure to communicate. Now, what Derrida says is you can qualify. You say, right, actually, you pictured a really big tree. Well, actually, what I meant was a small tree. So actually, what the person writing it might have written was a small tree. So now you picture a small tree, and you're getting closer now. But it's still totally different. That's a small tree surrounded by other bushes. Like it's kind of in a garden. It's a tree in a garden, small tree in a garden. It's quite, there's other trees around. It seems like maybe it's out in the countryside somewhere. Whereas this tree here this other tree here is clearly in the city, or at least with buildings around it. What about this tree? On the tree you're picturing on the left is a rich, lush tree. It's in bloom. You know, it's kind of it's obviously looking really healthy and great. Tree on the right it's either autumn or it's looking not particularly healthy, right? So you qualify. You say it's a small tree in the city. Then you say maybe it's a spindly tree in the city. You keep trying to get more and more accurate, but still you're never going to actually get to the point where you can communicate where the writer can communicate what was in their head into the other person's head. And so this is Derrida's completely different. I hope you see how completely different it is from Foucault. Again, how Foucault and Derrida are completely different from Deleuze, but how they're all connected with this idea of challenging the thought. There is no tree that when you read the word tree, you then think of what Plato would say, the Platonic form of the tree, and say, all right, I can picture exactly the tree that person who wrote this is talking about, because we both have access to this kind of heavenly ideal, the form of the tree. They're saying people seem to still believe that when they write the word tree, they're being as clear as they need to be. Or, you know, when they say it's an aspen surrounded by, you know, rose bushes on a hill on a cloudy day with 7 people standing around it, they think that you're now accurate. You've nailed it absolutely down, but there's still so many things play there. What are those people wearing? Do they need to cut their toenails? What kind of cloud is it? What's the light level? There's no way to actually ever get to the point where you're being absolutely specific with any concept. Remember, my example of the tree here is just an example. For you can apply any concept, and you have the same problem. So what Derrida is challenging, again, the concept of meta-narrative, again, questioning the stability of structures that we assume to be absolutely natural and stable, that we can rely upon without having to think about it. Derrida is doing it in a different way. He's especially doing it through text and the way that the texts are written, like actual written text, but then those ideas, that the philosophies that underwrite that, expand much larger. What he's not saying, just gave the game away. What he's definitely not saying, and this should realize I wanted to conclude with this, in the same way that say Foucault and Deleuze are not saying, you know, it's just a free for all and nothing means anything and love doesn't mean anything and anyone can love it. You know, it's not just open. There is still a social context for it. In the same way, when we read the word tree, we don't think of a lamp. At no point is it so bad that the communication is such that when I read the word tree, I think of lamp. That there are conditions where things like that happen, but in general, that's not the danger. So that's not what Derrida is saying. He's not saying words can mean anything. Any word can mean anything, meaning that any gesture in society or any statement in society or any belief in society can just suddenly be opened and read in a totally different way. There's still a framework of accuracy, but what he's trying to emphasize is what seemed previously like a singular, stable, kind of like a singular, solid rod of meaning. When we read the word tree, he's saying it's actually a much more flexible, open tube, maybe an open tube containing other multiple sort of infinite numbers of tubes of meaning when I'm trying to shoot my idea of tree into your brain, such that it's never possible to get absolutely for the reader, for the recipient, to understand the concept in the way that it was intended. Anyway, that's the point. It's not, postmodernism is not saying that everything is unattached and anything goes and everything is just dissolved and nothing means anything. What they're saying is the structures of our world must be understood, and we must see them as structures that most of the time we have created. Even when those structures are things beyond our control, like biology or physics, we have to understand that our response to them and our way of dealing with them is a product of our behavior. So ultimately, even though the natural world obviously exists, and even though the natural world, physics, biology, everything else, is beyond our control and has nothing to do with us in that sense, it doesn't exist just out there. Everything has to be passed and understood. Everything we engage with is passed and understood through human behavior, and therefore it immediately becomes a human thing that we control the understanding of, and therefore control our sense of our relationship with it. Now, again, that's science is a separate thing, but it's a very much part of this discussion. Anyway, seeing our structures and not denying or rejecting, but rather doing something else. And the doing something else has to be left open, because the whole point of postmodernism is that it's not stable. Everything is constantly potentially under analysis. And again, this doesn't mean that it's constantly unstable and nothing can be understood and you can never be certain of anything. What it means is that from one moment to the next, there is the possibility of meanings changing. Now, probably from 1 second to the next, and 1 minute and 1 day, and even 1 week to the next, meaning doesn't necessarily change all that much. But one need only look around our world today with the speed with which things change, the speed with which the last month of our lives our behavior has altered. You can see how postmodernists can make an argument for the flexibility of structures, and the understanding of what that really means. Again, it doesn't mean that they're saying that nothing exists, nothing is stable, nothing is fixed. No, that is what they're saying. They're saying nothing is fixed. What it doesn't mean is that nothing is worth fixing or trying to understand. Everything is in flux, but it's in a flux that we have to understand. So, we started this course, and we started it and we told it in a very specific way. We said that this European civilization began in Mesopotamia, and it has this fertile crescent. And we asked about civilization rooted in this word that comes from Latin. And we followed an absolutely traditional storyline, following, the civilizations of Mesopotamia and then Egypt as well, into ancient Greece, and this important difference between archaic and classical sculpture. So super important, and how it leads on to this later classical and Hellenistic sculpture. This idea of beauty. On the left, you've got the Apollo Belvedere that the early German art historians, meaning in the 17th, 18th century, thought was the most example of the most beautiful thing. On the right, you've got Venus de Milo, kind of representing, at least here for this lecture, beauty and what we think we mean by beauty. So here's this meta-narrative, right? European civilization is this thing that we believe in. And it is. It's a real thing. It is something to be seen, but it's not necessarily something to be believed in. Think about Gord's mentioning of the Morris quote there. Believe to be useful, believe to be beautiful, right? Know to be useful, believe to be beautiful. There's something in that. Come back to that later. The meta-narrative of European civilization is real. European civilization is real, and the meta-narrative itself is a story we can tell, and it makes sense, and it's made sense for a very long time, and a lot of people have committed a lot of energy to it. But it is still a meta-narrative. It is still a story. It is still something that specifically looks at certain things, excludes other things, sees the development of Europe from Sumeria, through Egypt, through Greece, through Rome, through Europe, through the Middle Ages, Gothic, Romanesque, etc., through development of the Enlightenment, etc., etc. That's a meta-narrative. It's not untrue, but what we need to do, and what the postmodernists have been doing since the 1960s has been challenging that, questioning the primacy that is given to that story over other stories. And it's not just a question of saying, oh, well, guess what? There were huge, massive civilizations in China, in the Indus Valley, in India and Pakistan, in South America. Africa is not just sort of one kind of morass that Bono from U2 can go just throw money at. Actually, it's a massive complex of cultures and peoples doing all sorts of different things, and have been historically. How the Europeans have told their story is one particular way of telling a perfectly true story. What the postmodernist challenging of that meta-narrative does is it doesn't say that story is completely rubbish and untrue. What it says is there's no such thing as truth, and we need to, at least in the sense of an absolute that we can kind of pin it on and say this is the only truth. We need to understand the things in the context. Just look at Venus here. This is beautiful. Arms. Pretend she has arms for a minute. I'm not saying anything about the necessity of arms or people who don't have arms. What I'm saying is if you open the pages of Vogue, what you get is Venus de Milo. You're getting a particular sense of beauty that has developed over the last 150 years that sort of connects with this kind of thing. It doesn't matter. Forget Venus de Milo. We have a sense of beauty that is a meta-narrative in our society. What postmodernism says is, okay, fine, but what else has that excluded? And it's not just a question of saying, uh, you don't have to be skinny to be beautiful. It's a question of saying, well, what do we even mean by beautiful, and how do we use this idea? And that doesn't mean, oh, there's no such thing as beauty. Everyone's beautiful. It doesn't even matter. We can talk about beauty. We can talk about beauty existing, and we can talk about someone being beautiful. But we have to understand what we mean when we're saying that, and we have to then allow for flexibility in the instability of those meanings. So all of the things we've talked about, everything I've talked about this term from a postmodern point of view, can be challenged, can be understood in different ways. The stories that we tell ourselves, the myths, meant so much. For example, here, the Trojan War, which is what we're seeing as sort of an example of a story from the Trojan War, had such a defining influence on so much Greek philosophy and literature, the storytelling, that it continues to define our society through. You can trace it. It's not direct necessarily, but you can trace the impact. And that meta-narrative that I told you, these progressions, these periods of progression, are not untrue. They're not inaccurate, but they are part of a meta-narrative that can be challenged and should be challenged. Now, as I've been saying, underneath all this, I think, I love the postmodernists, and I really respect postmodernism, and I find myself adopting aspects of postmodernism and thinking through things that I rely on as being stable through postmodern eyes, hopefully, or developing. As I say, I'm still developing as a postmodernist, but I'm never going to be a real postmodernist because I still believe in some kind of absolutes. Now, that's not the absolutes that necessarily seem obvious here. Um, the they're slightly bigger, and I don't want to start talking about that because A, I don't want to get too personal, and B, I mean, not that that's ever stopped me in the past, but right now I don't want to get too personal, and B, well, crikey, I look around me right now. I look around what's going on in our world. I read stories about MIT students who've invented $100 ventilators to deal with COVID. I look at everyone everywhere thinking about COVID. I go once a week to the supermarket or to Shoppers or something, and you look around, and right now it will probably change in the next few days. Some people are wearing masks, some people aren't wearing masks. To my mind, there is the action of collectivity there does rely on some kind of meta narrative, but I think the postmodernists would also argue that it's very easy to have that kind of community thinking without a meta narrative. So I'm not going to muddy the waters anymore. What I'm going to say is I look at this object and I think about how, if we allow for the fact that human beings exist, not just actually, but theoretically too, that there is such a thing as a human being, and one way or the other we create societies and civilizations. I look at this object and I see how profoundly design represents that and engages with that idea. The You don't need a meta narrative to understand and appreciate this object, but it makes the object more fun and more engaging. And again, I think that the postmodernists would not necessarily argue with that, or they would say that I'm not saying anything that they're not saying, something like that. Because ultimately it does come down to just being human. And I think postmodernism, where we will now leave this course, does the same thing that everything we've been talking about does, and it's just a flip side of it. It's just sort of an upside down. It's the inverse. It's the other side of the coin, to which this story that I've been telling through this course is the other side, which is to say there is a singular story. And it's not about Renaissance painters, but it is about the way we treat our world. So the way what the Renaissance painters represented for us was self-awareness. What the Gothic church represented for us was an understanding of a relationship between the person, the human being, and something beyond them, the God for them in their instance. And so for us, it means something different again, a relationship to the industrial perhaps, a tension between the industrial and the not industrial that we are especially thinking of today. And of course, I'm talking about in terms of environmental degradation. I'm talking about in terms of human scale and human existence, and how we see that what the causes of COVID is, for example, is human aggrandizement with any thought of anything else. All of that connects to a grand narrative, and it's the grand narrative that we see represented in the handprint from Chauvet Cave right here.